prophet Isaiah chapter 52. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace, who brings good news of happiness, who publishes salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. The voice of your watchmen, they lift up their voice. Together they sing for joy. For eye to eye they see the return of the Lord to Zion. Break forth together into singing, you waste places of Jerusalem. For the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. The Lord has bared his holy arm before the eyes of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. Amen. You may be seated. St. Paul would take this word of Isaiah after Christ had done what Christ did in order to save the world. And he started to talk about another Old Testament promise and prophecy. Everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. Then Paul begins the logical thinking. Well, now how can they be saved unless, and unless, and unless, and unless, and unless? It all goes to that word being proclaimed. And then he says, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. Quoting Isaiah. Today we might say, how beautiful is the car that drives the proclaimer to their congregation or to their mission field. How beautiful is the airplane that takes the missionary to a place that the Word of God has not been. How beautiful is the website, the keyboard perhaps, in which the good news is inputted and received and sent out and transmitted out into the world. Because this message is a message that the world needs to hear. I don't know about you, but I have a hard time watching the news for too long. Thankfully, they change personalities because they're basically going to tell me the same news again. I'm just going to hear it with a different delivery. And some of the deliveries I can handle better than others. Whereas some people say, no, I like that person, they're really passionate. And I say, there's too much passion. I just need to know the facts. But it's really difficult to turn on CNN, MSNBC, ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox News, any of the news channels. It's hard to look at any of the websites of these news organizations and find any kind of good news. Because good news doesn't sell. Catastrophes sell. Crisis sells. And so this is how they put it forth to us. I think to the point where we stop listening to them. Everything is a crisis. And so we start to get a little cynical, a little skeptical, as our doubt moves into outright, probably, rejection. If they say this, you start to wonder if this is right. Because they sell it so much, it's oversold. It's like the Weather Channel. Every time there's a storm coming into the east, I notice they never talk about the storms that might hit the Pacific Northwest coast. It's always, oh my goodness, get ready for Armageddon blizzard number 3 of the year. And after 2 inches of snowfall, people go, oh yeah, that's right. So we're used to the bad news. It makes money for people. Into a world of bad news comes the good news. Jesus Christ. So when you talk about the gospel is just a fancy Greek word translated into English that is simply good news. To be fair, it should be called great news. I don't know what Greek word that would have been. Awesome news. Best news ever. Extravagantly over the top, wonderful, blow your mind, lift your soul, inspire praises, news. That would be a very, very long Greek word. So in the understated way in which the Lord shares things, he just calls it good. This is good news. Good because it's morally good. Good because it's right and true. truth. Good because it counteracts the bad, the darkness. This is good news. How beautiful are the feet of him who proclaims the good news. And probably the very best proclaimer of the good news, and we do not give him credit for this, was the Word of God made flesh. We think of all the other great preachers in history, and we're astonished by them. Rarely do we stop and consider what the book of Hebrews says. In many and various ways, God spoke to his people by the prophets. He did it in a lot of strange and funny and weird ways. But now, in these last days, he has cut out all the bypasses. And he's spoken to us by his Son, the Word made flesh, the proclaimer of the good news, because he is the good news. How beautiful his feet must have been in that manger. Most people, probably the shepherds when they came, didn't see his feet. Mary had him all swaddled. That's one way they could find him. He was swaddled, lying in a manger. I doubt that they would have remarked and said, "What a beautiful child, but look at his feet. Those are the prettiest feet I've ever seen. They glow." Instead of putting the halo around his head, they put the halo around his feet. Probably just normal feet, huh? When he was born, his mom and dad probably did that thing that moms and dads do pretty quickly, and that's to say, is he okay? We don't know if Mary had a midwife there or if Joseph did the work, but there's that baby. And I can remember, I was one of those great blessed generations. Some of you may not have been there, where they actually let me in where my children were being born. And I started to wonder at a point, well, why am I here? Because this is so incredibly humbling. It will just drop you to your knees about what's about to happen. And especially as that firstborn came, and it's the first experience you have with it, no offense, number 3 and 4. But that first one, it's the first time you've done it. And you suddenly get this smaller than what you expected child put into your arms. And the first thing a dad does is count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Jesus had normal baby feet, small. Not particularly different than anybody else's, except these feet are the Word of God trotting and walking on our earth. And those feet took him not very far. As Tess is looking at the map of Israel as we're getting ready, she goes, it's not very big. Jesus didn't wander very far. But look where those feet took him and what the good news that he brought. They brought him to the city of Nain, where he stopped the procession and raised the sun. They walked him in and out of Jericho, where lepers were. He walked to the pool of Bethsaida and healed. He walked into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. They were dragged, perhaps, down from the Garden of Gethsemane into Caiaphas' palace, pulled along before Pilate, stumbles on the Via Dolorosa, the way of suffering on the way out to Golgotha. finally, these feet, these beautiful feet, are pierced. As these feet have lived their life and grown and walked, they have walked in the will of God the Father, perfectly, step for step for step. And now they carry the weight of the sin of the world. And when they're lifeless and they can no longer hold him up, these beautiful feet, along with the rest of the body, the incarnate Word of God, are laid in a tomb. Thanks be to God. On the third day, those beautiful feet were used again. Christ stood there before Mary. Christ walked into a locked room. He walked on the road to Emmaus. He was alive. And Isaiah says, rejoice, waste places of Israel. Can you think of the waste places in your life? Maybe you even sometimes feel like your whole life is a waste place. That maybe you don't think you have anything worth redeeming in you. And to be honest with you and fair with you, you don't. There's not an unbroken person walking this planet. And yet, to the waste places of Israel, to the waste places of your soul, proclaim good news and rejoice. Because how beautiful are the feet of Christ, who lived the message and preached the message, and now sends the message out all over the globe. For a man who didn't walk very far, his touch is international and across time and history. And there is not a person who's not redeemable by this Lord. There is nothing in you in the deepest, darkest, hidden places that he does not and cannot walk with his light and his life. How beautiful are these feet of Jesus to bring the good news and to bring it into you and into me. You have an opportunity to have beautiful feet also. Two ways. When he returns, you will be like him. And I'm guessing that there's a big chunk of you that's going to be at a halo, including your feet. Therefore, who are you going to share that message with? Who do you know that is receiving nothing but bad news? Bad news in their life, bad news that they have created themselves. Maybe it's just their worldview. Maybe they just look at everything cynically and darkly because they have no other experience of light. Who is it that needs to hear the good news? Is it someone you know? Is it somebody in your family? Is it a stranger you're going to encounter that you don't even know yet? You have the opportunity to have beautiful feet. And it will be the hardest thing you'll ever do that is the easiest thing you'll ever do. Everything in you will say, walls, no, can't do. That's the hard part. The easy part is you do not need to be a theologian. You do not need to be a pastor. You just have to know him and talk about him and share him and tell his story and share that, believe it or not, God redeems your waste places. He's come for that very reason. How beautiful are the feet of those who share good news. Because as Isaiah would wrap up our lesson today, the Lord has laid bare his holy arm. And it's the arm of an infant, later stretched on a cross, later still raised in blessing. What a God we have. What a blessing we have. That, my friends, is the good news. To God be the glory, and have a very, very Merry Christmas.